Thanks, everybody. We just heard from 4 companies. We originally had 5, but one of the participants was sick and he couldn't travel. So unfortunately, he wasn't able to come, but we might talk about that company too. But mostly the broad area here is oral therapies in retina. It's not absolutely new, but it's pretty new, and it's certainly new in the current era. We've been injecting every eye under the sun for the last 20 years. People talk about drops now, oral therapies. I'm fascinated by it because the indications are obvious. You just heard from 4 great speakers about what the indications might be, and they make a lot of sense. And we have 3 great experts here who are going to help me to explore that. And each of these guys are great clinician scientists, and innovators and entrepreneurs in their own right who have developed products. So maybe each of you guys could introduce yourselves. Why don't you start, Paul?
Thanks for us. I'm Paul Karpecki, and it's interesting because my main practice is in cornea external disease, but my first love was actually in retina. I did a VA residency, of course, optometric residency in 1993, and then had a cornea opportunity, but I never lost sight of that. I did a preceptorship in retina at a top 20 retina practice, Retina Associates of Kentucky, with John Kitchens, Tom Stone, and that group for 2 years. And then stayed on until they eventually got acquired by a PE group, and they needed me to stay 4 days a week, which was impossible to do. So I was up till about 2021 and the end of that. So retina's kind of been a big focus. My role there was really to educate colleagues about some of these applications. And then, of course, as an optometrist, we have 50 states where you can prescribe oral. So honored to be on the panel.
Alan Franklin, physician scientist. I have a pretty busy clinical practice in Mobile, Alabama. I'm founder of ForwardVue Pharma also, which is a company directed at a novel treatment for vascular diseases of the retina and posterior segment. Again, we have a novel therapy, a durable platform, and we're looking for a Series A raise.
Shameless plug, but I told him to do it. I wanted him to do that. Bob, you can also plug any of your innovations too, but introduce yourself first and then go for it, man.
I'm Bob Bhisitkul. I'm a retina surgeon too, on the faculty at UCSF for many, many years now, and have had a lot of fun over this time working with some of the companies, especially in the early stage of development, clinical development. And also out of UCSF, we have a spin-off startup that is involved in drug delivery called Oculinea. So if the oral therapies really work, it would put our company completely out of business.
So you know where he's going to go when I ask him these questions. Now he's too honest for that. I've known him over 20 years. All right, let's start with a couple of, I wanted to start by exploring clinical trial design and or endpoints, because this is changing now, or we think so. OcuFire's done a great job. They may be the first ones, at least that I'm aware of, who's shooting for a binocular endpoint, and it may have happened without necessarily that being their original plan, but they got some positive information in their trial that a 3-step change in diabetic retinopathy severity score binocularly, meaning cumulatively between the 2 eyes, is what's being set from them, and this may be a new paradigm. So I want to hear from you guys. Paul, maybe you can start how you view this new image of a binocular endpoint in a clinical trial, both from a regulatory standpoint and then in your mind in taking care of patients from a clinical standpoint.
Thanks, Firas. Actually, I think it makes a lot of sense. You think about systemic drug, oral medications. It's not like a topical where you're targeting one eye and putting it in there and, of course, using that single eye as an endpoint. You're going to get a systemic effect binocularly. And, of course, because of retinal tissue, it should be pretty comparable between the two. So I think, for me, it makes a lot of sense, both from a primary endpoint, but also from a logical perspective. I'm trying to think about what I'm going to use in patients when I'm going to go with an oral route rather than a topical, or whether I refer to a retina specialist like up here for injections. I'm going to assume that the topical, if they're applying to both eyes, may have the benefit, but from an oral, it's going to automatically be pretty equally distributed between both eyes, and therefore I kind of want to see that bilateral outcome as an endpoint.
What do you think about, and then I want all of you guys to chime in after, but I'll start with Paul. The measurement that we're laying out here is a 3-step improvement versus protection of worsening, which is what we're hearing. You have any thoughts on that? Improvement versus the protection against worsening?
Well, I think if you look at Panorama and other studies that came out, we started seeing, improvements in diabetic retinopathy that were of that level of 2-3 steps. It changed the game in our sense of knowledge of it. It didn't change our, a lot of optometrists would refer a patient into our clinic when I was a retina associate, and then because of either lack of coverage for an anti-VEGF injection to try and improve the diabetic retinopathy, the patient would go back, and my colleagues would say, well, you didn't do anything. I'm not going to send you any more patients for a DR indication. So, I think that, though, the point to that is knowing that it has that capability with injections and intravitreal injections, as you all do, that sets the stage for what we need to or want to accomplish going forward. And I think it'll have a huge impact, because if my colleagues are referring patients to retina specialists, they do. It's a very good system for allowing that. They're going to want to see some sort of improvement. And 3-stage, while a little aggressive, does give us that. But we have historic data in those studies, including Panorama, that suggest that's what we should be looking for.
Al, what's your take on this?
I mean, I think in terms of it's great to see reduction of diabetic severity, diabetic retinopathy severity, but at the end of the day, I've seen Wiley talk from the podium. You're looking at vision, and you're looking at vision-threatening events, and I think ultimately these compounds are going to have to show either long-term protection of vision or long-term protection from visually threatening events.
So you think from a regulatory standpoint, the binocular, let's say, for example, 3-step improvement or 3-step protection of worsening won't necessarily be good enough alone from a regulatory standpoint?
I think it may be good enough from a regulatory standpoint, but when I do surgeries and I have to click on each of my diabetic medicines, or my diabetic patients' medicines, and there are like 30 of them, and we're going to add another one that really doesn't do anything to improve vision. So from a regulatory standpoint, it may be a significant goal, but in clinical practice, I don't know how important it is unless you can show, again, protection of vision or reduction of vision-threatening events.
I'm kind of interested in the latter part of that. Maybe, Bob, I'll turn to you for this, and please comment on that. The protection against what I refer to as, falling off the cliff, PDR development, significant central DME development. Those are ancillary, maybe the most important features, as Alan's implied. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, this is I think a big breakthrough, and Occuphire has paved the way for it on this to be a biomarker for upcoming clinical trials. I don't have any doubt that if you can slow the progression of NPDR, you're going to reduce the incidence of diabetic macular edema and proliferative diabetic retinopathy and vision loss, just as George McGrath has shown us in his talk. Now, it might take 5 or 10 years before you see that, and so that's not realistic for our clinical trials. So let's not look a gift horse in the mouth. If Wiley Chambers is giving us DRSS, 3-step change between the 2 eyes, and I love the binocularity of oral medication. That's fantastic, and anybody that's doing, Eylea injection in the right eye this week, 2 weeks later, Eylea injection in the left eye, come back again 2 weeks later, that bilateral treatment is very heavy. So I think we lose sight that diabetic retinopathy, even in the absence of DME and PDR, is sickness in the eye. The blood vessels are spilling blood. They're breaking blood vessels in your retina, and we've sort of been blasé about that. But if you can halt that, I think it doesn't take a big conceptual leap to know that you're also going to halt the blinding aspects of this. It may not show up in a clinical trial that you've changed the vision, because again, as numerous people have emphasized already today, this is non-invasive and it's preventative, which is where we really want to be in medicine. We don't want to try to come and rescue the eye after the bomb has already gone off.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I'm glad you referenced the Panorama trial. I'm going to come back to that because I think that falling off the cliff data there is pretty impressive and compelling, but I want to revisit that. I want to start, and maybe we'll start on this side. Talk to me about what patients ought to be viewed in this treatment paradigm. We know that in the Panorama trial and other anecdotal data, it's been so-called moderate to severe or severe NPDR. That's who we've been looking at, and with some great, very compelling results. How about now? Is this the same people should be looked at here, or should we also expand it to mild diabetic retinopathy or moderate diabetic retinopathy?
We're not comparable to Panorama when we're talking about an oral drug, especially an oral drug that's safe. So I don't think the same threshold and the same standard applies when I no longer have to talk about putting a needle in the eye every month. Here's an example. We have a good drug for oral therapy for retinal disease. AREDS vitamin supplement for macular degeneration, okay? And why not start every patient who has some level of dry AMD on the AREDS vitamin? Well, I think it might be the same for diabetic retinopathy. Mild non-proliferative diabetic retinopathy, sure, throw it on if it's safe, and maybe that's done for everybody, and it's not even done by the retina specialist. Maybe it's done by the general ophthalmologist or the optometrist or by their primary doctor, and that could have a huge population effect in terms of keeping people out of my office.
Great end result there. I know, too many injections. We're all feeling that. Alan and Paul, either of you, why don't you chime in here? Who would you consider using this for? Who do you think is a must-do? Maybe, as Bob's saying, it's all of them. What do you think?
I think Bob hit the nail on the head. I think safety is critical in all this, and if these compounds are safe, on the positive end, the kidney vasculature, this may respond as well, as we saw in one of the presentations. On the potential negative end, for the heart, VEGF is actually increased as there's blockage of vessels. So we just have to be really careful and have to ensure these compounds are safe. But if they're safe, why wouldn't you use it earlier?
Paul, what do you think?
I have to agree with Alan, and I think Bob did hit it on the nail on the head, because if you think about, the sooner you can get to less invasive, like, I really think the reason why we don't see a lot of injections for DR, not DME, of course, or anything falling off the cliff, is simply, it's not just the coverage. It also seems like, hey, the risk reward of injecting when we're doing so many of them, do we need to do that? That's why we're not seeing a high percentage of it. So that tells me that Bob and Alan are right, that the positioning for this is going to be in the earlier stages, perhaps when you're starting to see some diabetic retinopathy and hoping to get some slowdown or some change. I think by the time they're already experiencing DME or progressing towards PDR, it's time to send the patient, obviously, over to the retina specialist. But then this gives us an opportunity prior to that to perhaps do similar to what AREDS 2 can do in slowing this down. It doesn't stop us by any means from eventually getting a patient who's wet over to the retina specialist, or a patient who may need GA therapy if they've progressed to that point. But it certainly has a role, and it fits in to the ideal patients where they're studied, which is your intermediate stage and above. And I think that's where this would fit in, provided, as Alan said, we're getting potential other effects, and we're not seeing any detrimental side effects or any significant side effects based on an oral medication, which is obviously going to be higher than topical. So I'm in agreement.
Great, I am too. I think the whole point of this is don't let them go towards the edge of the cliff. Makes perfect sense, which for those of you out here developing oral drugs, that gives you the answer. It's just a gigantic marketplace of patients, enormous, and I think these companies are aware of that. One final point or question with regard to the clinical trial differences now. With dry AMD, we now have a model for clinical trial outcomes with 2 companies reaching approval with GA. How does this impact that? Are we going to get a new set of parameters for bilateral endpoints with oral drugs? Bob, you want to start? What do you think?
Yeah, I think, your question gets to the underlying point that all the clinical trials we've done in the past 15 years have been based on the VEGF model, and we all have the VEGF mind virus that we think that trials have to be conducted with that OCT thickness and vision change and visits every month. So here, with an oral drug intervening at an earlier stage, maybe we will start looking at a patient population that doesn't have DME, that just has bilateral NPDR, and you can look at the effects there. Maybe we can start looking at not monthly visits in a clinical trial, but see the patient the first month to make sure there's no bad effects. Check back in with them 6 months later, and then endpoint at a year or at a year and a half. It makes it a much more tenable cost because we don't need to bring them in to do injections.
I agree. Any other thoughts, either of you guys?
Yeah, I think it's really encouraging to see both less invasive therapies and then the multitude of therapies for dry AMD. The presentation from Inflammix, I'm sorry we missed today, because I think that's a great target, and we've seen actually more different targets for dry AMD than we have for wet AMD over the past couple of days, which I think is great for progress of the field.
I'm glad you brought up targets, and I want to start with Paul on this because these were all, unlike the VEGF era, maybe we're entering into an era, pretty disparate mechanisms of action, and there are more out there that we didn't hear from yet today. Any particular mechanism sound appealing to you, Paul? I mean, we don't have a lot of framework for this yet, but these were all fascinating scientific programs.
To me, a couple things. One, I'll finish with the question prior real quickly too on the kind of the endpoints, then get into that, because I think while covered really, really well, I think one of the big things, and I think Bob said this, we have kind of an AREDS2 formulation, which essentially does slow progression. We've seen that clinically. It does extremely well on the market, and commonly prescribed by everyone, ophthalmologist, retina specialist, and certainly a general ophthalmologist. And I think that, but what amazes me about that whole GA category, and why I don't think we may necessarily, so there's two parts to it. One, since we've been using things like AREDS, we're very familiar with an early start. And to a fault, sometimes clinicians even use AREDS2 formulations prior to when they should, prior to intermediate, but they're so comfortable with it that it becomes, hey, I can begin here. So an oral that can achieve that will always have a place. But I don't see how it can necessarily, it could, but based on the mechanisms, this goes into your second question, I'm not sure that it can really prevent perhaps some of the slowing down of maybe of some of the devitalized cells in the RPE layer, because we're seeing that also with the injections of the complement system type drugs, we're seeing that. But the big hope in that category is actually the next wave. It's the layer outside of that, the RPE that's still healthy. What do we do to that? Do we halt it because they're not devitalized? Like, I can understand how the complement system can help with if it's already atrophied, can't do anything about that. If it's devitalized RPE cells, I see the slowing effects by the data that we've seen from both drugs. The real key is what's outside of that. What does it do to the tissue that's healthy? Are we able to actually halt it if we can look at 5-year data, 7-year data, 10-year data? And that's really what makes that whole category exciting. So on the AMD side, while I do think there's a place, obviously there's no downside to using AREDS2, probably no downside to using orals. You don't want to get to the point where you've let it go too far that you can't help those devitalized cells, where we're still sending them to a retina specialist. So that becomes a very different paradigm, and where does it fit in, and when do we have the cutoff? And we don't have enough data yet to figure that out, but that's the way I think we have to be thinking. And on the diabetic side, I think it's a little easier. The mechanisms that, and I think Alan covered this really well, that may have other benefits systemically because it's an oral pill, maybe on kidney function, as we saw in the presentations and other categories, make that an extremely appealing approach as well. But anything that can slow down retinopathy, that can prevent more injections, that can really prevent this, so you said for us, falling off the cliff, are going to have a place. But on the AMD side, I think we got to really figure out when do we do that shift so we don't lose too many cells before we have to do a potential injection to slow it down.
Alan, you kind of expert in some of these mechanisms in the past. You've taught me a few things. What's your take on some of these mechanisms?
I mean, I think it's great. I think that we'll have an evolution in our field. When you look at our colleagues who are oncologists, they have induction therapy and maintenance therapy. They have intravenous stuff, local stuff, oral stuff. I think we're evolving in that same pathway, and it's not going to be like, well, there's fluid, you need a shot. There's no fluid, come back and see me in a couple weeks. I mean, that's not all that
them know it's
intellectually
that simple.
stimulating.
They'll stop paying us even worse than they do now. It is that simple, though. Bob, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it speaks to something that these oral drugs, almost by definition, will have to use a different MOA than VEGF. And Praveen Duggal talked to it this morning in that great talk. My entire career, which is now pretty long, has been VEGF and then nothing else.
More VEGF? Or
Nothing
steroids?
else.
Steroids.
So for 20 years, we haven't had anything move beyond VEGF. Steroids were always around, and yes, they're good drugs. But I think it's very exciting now that, maybe we will have this next mechanism of action that we can apply for our patients. We have the complement inhibitors now. They have their limitations. It might not be the miracle drug that VEGF was, but I think it's still a major breakthrough. And so we're looking for some of these other MOAs to help patients.
And I agree. I see a little bit, to Bob's point real quickly. I know we're going to wrap it up
That's
here for
okay.
us, but you think about most invasive, you think about infusions, where people have to go in for an hour, 2 hours, and yet Tepez is $1 billion drug, so it does well. They say that if there were injections or orals are coming, you're going to see a lot of cannibalization of that area, as long as it's not that intermediary, which we're describing right now. And then ultimately topicals, when we're talking about what we're doing, we have to continue to look at those become less and less invasive. And if you are able to show efficacy, or slowing, or as you said so well, that transitional, that prior to getting to the retina specialist, the less invasive, the more likely doctors are going to be to utilize it. And orals will be that first bridge. Topicals will eventually probably even be beyond that. So we want to continue to look at the entire pipeline where things are going, and we'll learn more as we get availability to these drugs.
Yeah, I agree. We're looking more and more like immuno-oncology with the various concoctions and combinations. I had a lot more stuff for these guys, but we're out of time, so I'm going to ask you to stay for a minute afterwards. I have a quick announcement or two, but in the meantime, please help me thank these guys for their time. Thanks a lot. Thank you.